Okay, I think that we should start because I think that people have a lot of ground to cover here.
Okay.
Okay, so welcome everybody to this roundtable on pandemics past and present. I'm Robin Bates from the Department of History here at Northwestern. I want to briefly mention that this talk is going to be recorded and it will be posted to the Chabraja Center for Historical Studies website. That's historicalstudies.northwestern.edu. Once again, many thanks to Elżbieta Fuller-Pituk and Gil Engelstein at Chabraja for making this whole event possible. And I want to then immediately get into introducing our first speaker, who is Ed Muir, the Clarence L. Versteeg Professor in Arts and Sciences and Professor of History and Italian, an outstanding historian of Renaissance Italy. Professor Muir is the recipient of numerous honors, and I'd use up all of his time if I listed them, but I'm just going to briefly say that his distinguished publication record includes Civic Ritual in Renaissance Venice, winner of the Herbert Baxter Adams Prize from the American Historical Association, and the Howard R. Mararo Prize in Italian History, Mad Blood Stirring, Vendetta and its Factions in Friuli during the Renaissance, again winning the Howard R. Mararo Prize, and his current book project is The Delicate Sinews of Trust, the Italian Renaissance 1350 to 1650. Today, Professor Muir will begin our discussion with his reflections on one of the most profoundly terrifying and enduringly fascinating pandemics, the Black Death of the 14th century. Professor Muir.
Thank you. Let me see if I can get my screen up. Let's see. Does everybody see that okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. Let me start with the way an old-fashioned historian does it, with a source, a text. This is from a diary kept during the summer of 1348 in the town of Siena, a town of about 50,000 people. Before the Black Death, a major banking center. After the Black Death, it never regained its population of the pre-Black Death until 1952. This is from the diary of a man named Agnolo di Tura. And on June 2nd of 1348, the city government records just stop. This is as if everyone in City Hall just either died or took off. And here's what he wrote. Father abandoned child, wife, husband, one brother, another, and for this illness seemed to strike through the breath and sight. This is an important detail here. And so they died. And none could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship. Members of a household brought their dead to the ditch as best they could, without priest, without divine offices. Not only did the death bell not sound, and not only the death bell did not sound, and in many places in Siena, great pits were dug and piled deep with a multitude of dead. And I, Agnolo di Tura, called the Fat, buried my 5 children with my own hands. And there were those who were so sparsely covered with earth that the dogs dragged them forth and devoured many bodies throughout the city. And then a more famous little quote from the introduction to the Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through this and then wrote his famous 100 stories, in some ways in response to the Black Death. In the year 1348, after the fruitful incarnation of the Son of God, the most beautiful of Italian cities, noble Florence, was attacked by a deadly plague. The symptoms, and again, the details here are important, began in both men and women with certain swellings in the groin and under the armpit. They grew to the size of a small apple or an egg, more or less, and were vulgarly called tumors. In short space of time, these tumors spread from the 2 parts named to black and purple spots. And those spots appeared in the arms and thighs or in either part of the body. Sometimes a few large ones, sometimes many little ones. And these spots were a certain sign of death, just as the original tumor had been and still remains. So we have descriptions from the time of the physical symptoms, as well as the idea that it somehow spread very rapidly from one person to another, which raises a whole set of questions. Here I have for you some just basic statistics of the mortality rates. between 75 and 200 million people in Eurasia and North Africa. We have no evidence that it ever reached the Americas. And as you can see in Europe, where we have quite good statistics, population drops. In 1300, we have 74 million, 1400, 52 million across the continent, depending on where we are. The death toll is somewhere between a third and a half, although of all the people alive, although it was as usual, very young children and older people died more rapidly. So there was a demographic bulge created. And of course, it's variable. Cities much worse than the countryside. Some places, the population entirely disappeared. We have whole villages in England, for example, which were only rediscovered after people examined aerial photographs. And you can see there once was a village there. And then archaeology has shown that it disappeared in 1348 or shortly thereafter. Now, what are the causes? This is actually more controversial than one would have thought. I have a textbook. I'm now in the 5th edition. And in each new edition, nothing has changed more often than how I describe the causes of the Black Death. So it shows you that it's a very active area of research, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's changed in the last few years. First, let me a couple of things to explain clearly. There is a series of events leading up to the 1348 events that clearly are a series of famines and minor plagues and epidemic diseases, so that we have a population that has already been kind of beaten up, that is highly vulnerable to infectious diseases through malnutrition. There's probably a Malthusian crisis of just not having enough food to go around. And then the first signs of what we would call the Little Ice Age now, particularly the Great Famine, as you can see here, of 1315 to 17, when there's just no harvest all across Europe. The rain never seems to stop, and there's massive famine. The Little Ice Age is another area of great controversy, but there's quite good evidence that in the early 14th century, the first glimmerings of a climactic change are taking place. Probably leads to a mean annual decline in temperature of about 1 degree to 1.5 degrees centigrade, which means up in the mountains in Switzerland, for example, you can't survive anymore. And of course, the most famous example is perhaps the Scandinavian colonies in Greenland just disappear. Now, so there's reasons, it's clearly linked in some ways to a climatic change. Now, what is exactly the disease? I think one of the old hypothesis, and it's maybe come back, is that the host for the Yersinia Pestis, about which I'll talk about in a second, were marmots in Central Asia, who are perhaps driven out of the highlands due to climate change and to no longer viable up in the mountains, become somehow connected to or transported through the Silk Road across Central Asia. Probably other rodents, and particularly rats, pick up this disease, and it arrives in the Black Sea, and then from the Black Sea region into Europe and in North Africa in 1347 and after that. Now, that's the hypothesis based upon the idea that the Black Death was really what's called Yersinia Pestis, which was discovered by Alexander Yersin, a student of Pasteur's in 1894, when he came to San Francisco to see what was going on there when the Black Death reappeared, or a bubonic plague, as he identified it as. Assuming he's right, this was the third global pandemic. The first was back in the time of the Emperor Justinian. We call that the Justinian plague, early 6th century. The Black Death of 1347-48, which continued to come back on a frequency of almost every 20 years into the 18th century, with some cases which were almost as bad as 1348. 1400, the population of Florence half dies again. 1630, 31, 33, major plague throughout the whole Mediterranean, and may help explain why Northern Europe has an economic advantage henceforth after the middle of the 17th century. Okay, the Yersinia Pestis has a complicated epidemiology that involves fleas that are living off of rats or biting rats, the host, and that would then somehow drop onto human beings. Or a more complicated hypothesis would be that that those fleas would be attached to human fleas, that is to say, fleas that can move from person to person, because fleas coming from rats to people don't go just like that, as the text I just read said. And then it becomes airborne through initially a bubonic plague that requires blood transfer from an infected rat to, as a secondary infection, a pneumonic plague. That could go obviously through the air, like what we're suffering through right now with COVID. This third kind of plague is septicemic. That doesn't seem to play much of a role there. And then there's the argument that there was other viruses involved indeed. I think what we know of any historian, and Helen can say more about this than I, historian of medicine knows that it's kind of a fool's paradise to make retrospective diagnoses of diseases, especially something from nearly 700 years ago, and especially since diseases mutate and change. So we don't know exactly, but we have found in France and now most recently in England among 14th century graves, residues of Yersinia Pestis in the DNA. So it was there. It may not by any means explain everything. I think the most convincing work I've read is by a historian and she's also a physician at Indiana named Ann Carmichael, who says this is a complex of diseases of a highly vulnerable population, and frequently, because of the fear of the bubonic plague, there was a lot of claiming this was a bubonic plague when something came wrong. Now, so here you can see a chart, obviously, of how long it took. This is the European population to recover from the Black Death. As it keeps coming back, keeping the population fairly static, small raises and declines up until about the late 17th century when it takes off again. And the 18th century, it really takes off again. Here you can see its spread coming from the Black Sea. 1347 is this area in Anatolia and the Caucasus, then arrives probably aboard a ship, a Genoese ship that comes to Sicily and Pisa. And then in 1348, it spreads throughout the rest of the Mediterranean basin and then slowly into northern Europe and into, this would be obviously from the Republic of Novgorod and that area here. And other areas don't seem to be affected at all. Parts of Eastern Europe that aren't particularly heavily populated aren't. It has a profound effects. The effects are much easier to follow. Obviously, there's going to be a labor shortage, which should mean there should be a rise in wages. And there's a huge struggle throughout the 14th century, a series of peasant revolts and workers' revolts who recognize that they ought to be able to raise their wages and have trouble doing it. The manuscripts are full of illustrations like this, the Black Death here strangling this poor man. This is a confessional manual in which the death figure is stabbing like Christ with a spear the dying man in his bed. Here's the priest trying to pray for him. This is as a remarkable little. This is a chronicle in the midst of which you saw a pile of bodies, and up here you see, you can read on between December and January of 1348. It says, and then there were deaths in many places, and thousands of people died. All in red ink to emphasize what happened. Again, another chronicle. This is in Latin, as you can see, and people are just building coffins right and left to take care of things. And this is a fresco from northern Italy Obviously, you can see 1464 when he's describing a later plague, and the angel comes to kill the plague man, and there's dead plague figure, dead lying outside the city walls. But the figures I want to point to are here. These people in white robes, which is in many ways the common response, which is to say, creation of penitential companies, flagellants who flagellate themselves in order to expiate the sin that had brought this about. Obviously, it didn't really work. It particularly attracted young men and became particularly socially dangerous as these companies of flagellants moved from town to town. Here you can see them. They're a little hard to see the whips, but they got them right there. You can see one, and other ones whipping themselves as they go through in a kind of dramatic procession. And many times these penitential processions led to violence. So the linkage between climate change, pandemic disease, and social violence is not hard to trace in the 14th century for lots of reasons, partly because of the economic problems and collapse, also because of a religious atmosphere which emphasizes the sinfulness of humankind. Now, there are some practical results that are, I think, lasting and important. And that involves, as Angelo Di Tura called the fat, just said, there was nobody to bury these people. There was a huge piles of bodies. And so you have the creation of at first, religious companies devoted to taking care of the sick. This is an image of one, and this is they're carrying this sick man. These are volunteers, laymen, who do this for the betterment of the community, typically hooded, as you can see here, and making sure that the ill get taken to whatever facility is available. And of course, and these companies still exist, actually. They're founded mostly in the 14th century. In all parts of Europe, especially in Italy, the local ambulance squads are volunteers. They're trained nowadays. And they're the direct heirs. You can see this is Misericordia Milano. Misericordia is the name of the company that was founded in the 14th century. And here they're, taking some poor kid who's had a motorcycle accident. When I first lived in Italy in the 1960s, these ambulance drivers dressed like that. They wore black hoods over their heads. They've given that up now and dressed more like ambulance drivers everywhere else. But it shows that there's a long-lasting tradition that comes out of this, including all kinds of religious organizations, confraternities. This is a confraternity in Venice devoted to the patron saint who helps you against epidemic diseases, Saint Roche, against the Black Death. Extremely wealthy. And there were 5 or 6 of these in Venice, and they built housing as a charitable obligation for widows and orphans and people who were too poor for housing. To this day, something like 65 to 70% of the housing in the city of Venice is owned by one of these organizations. A very, very long-lasting sense of community obligation. Hospitals for orphans, the first orphanage built in Europe, I think, and certainly the most important one in Italy is Hospital of the Innocents in Florence. And here you can see the little baby wrapped in swaddling clothes. These orphans would be brought to the orphanage and just left. And if they were lucky, they survived, but it was a pretty rough, probably life for them, as well as major religious organizations. This is a plague church. This is called the Church for Salute, for health in Venice. So the effects are immediate, lasting, both in terms of civic obligations and kind of a religious cult that develops around it. So that's my part, and I will get off the sharing if I can figure out how to do that. Stop share, it says, right?
Yep. Green button at the bottom.
Yeah, let me find it. Mine just moved. Okay, let's just do that.
So I'd like to thank Ed and quickly mention that if anyone has questions, they can put them in the chat for later.
Okay.
And no, it was a really wonderful presentation. And our next speaker that I'm going to introduce is Joel Mokyr, who's the Robert H. Strout Professor of Arts and Sciences and Professor of Economics and History, as well as the Sackler Professor at the Eitan Berglas School of Economics at the University of Tel Aviv. I can only begin to suggest the breadth of Professor Mokyr's immense contributions to economic history, but his publications have won many prizes, including the Schumpeter Prize, the Ranke Prize of the Economic History Association, and the Donald Price Prize of the American Political Science Association, and his most recent book, co-winner of the Social Science History Association's Alan Sharlin Memorial Award, is A Culture of Growth, The Origins of the Modern Economy. Today, Professor Mokyr is going to share his thoughts on the global flu pandemic of a century ago in light of our current struggle with COVID. Professor Mokyr.
Yeah, thank you. Am I being heard, or
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, good, excellent, thank you. So this is going to be much more presentist than Ed's presentation. It's going to be a straight comparison between the so-called Spanish flu, and I put quotes on that because I actually don't want anybody to think that this is at all comparable to the Chinese pandemic that we're experiencing today, and that should be in double quotes. But I want to make a specific point about the difference between these two. So what they share, I think everybody knows, they're both caused by a highly contagious virus, and you may well ask, what's a virus and is it even alive? And I can do no better than quote the Peter and Jean Medawar, which is define the virus as a piece of bad news wrapped up in protein, which is more or less what it is. But one difference between now and then is, of course, that we know a lot more about what's hitting us than people did then. The actual virus behind the 1918 pandemic wasn't actually identified until 1935, whereas in 2020, the genomic sequence of the virus was completed a couple of months after it arrived, and we have hugely powerful tools in immunology, virology, molecular genetics, and epidemiological modeling available. And so, the question is that the good news? It may seem so, but I'm going to argue that it's sort of a double-edged sword, and it may underline the belief that this pandemic will be short-lived, or to coin a phrase, the end is just around the corner with something. I can't remember where I heard that, but a phrase has been around. So actually, that may be costly, as I'm going to argue. So the basic argument, the take-home message is essentially this. In demographic terms, the so-called Spanish flu of 1918 was far worse than COVID-19 has been, at least so far, okay? But it seems like that's going to stay there. In economic effect, COVID-19 is far worse. And the question is why? So let me give you a little bit of the demographic background. In 1918, the demographic news was really, really bad. The best estimate of worldwide mortality, and this is a great deal of uncertainty around it, particularly because of bad statistics in Asia. But this is the Johnson and Muller 2002 paper, who put the number of dead at about 50 million, which they think is an underestimated, and they say could be double as high. Now, the world's population at the time was about 1.8 billion. So we're looking at an excess mortality rate of 2.8%. So you apply that to today's world population, that would mean 218 million people dead, which compares to a COVID death toll, to date at least, of about 1.2 million, which looks almost like a rounding error by comparison, okay? I mean, that's obviously not much of a consolation to people who got hit, but the numbers are the numbers. So in the US, the numbers aren't quite that stark, but still in the same sort of ballpark. The death toll of the 1918 flu has been estimated in the United States to be about 675,000, which on a population of about 100 million, this would be about 0.67%. So if you apply that to today's population, that would be approximately 2 million deaths, which is about 7 times higher than the estimated death toll of the coronavirus up to, more or less today. And what's more, the age distributions differ. So the mortality distribution of 1918 is in some sense more costly than then, because the flu is particularly devastating for people in their prime working age. So this is the famous W-shaped age distribution, which sort of peaks at 28, whereas of course today, as we know, the most lethal effects are on older people. So here's this W-shaped form. I cheated a little bit because the data here are actually from Canada, but this is the best looking W curve that I could find. The American data, however, still look quite W-ish. The one you want to look at is the light blue one, which is of course 1918. You can see in the others too, there's sort of this very vague rise of people in their, in their mid-age, but that's mostly tuberculosis. And yet, if you look at the economic effects today, they are much more pronounced. And in large part, that is because of NPIs, as it's known, sort of non-pharmaceutical interventions, okay? So these were, of course, around in 1918, imposed mostly by cities, sometimes at the state level. And they ranged from shutting down public gathering and crowded places to some staggering business hours and so on. But nothing went as far as closing all of non-essential businesses as we have done in the 2020 pandemic and seem to be on the way of doing again. So we're far more willing to take drastic and costly measures today, because I think, and I'll come back to that, is because we think the pandemic will be short-lived. And so the difference in results are quite remarkable. This is, many of these graphs, by the way, I've borrowed from my work of Francois Wilde from the Chicago Fed. But this is actually employment. So if the curve goes down, that means there's a rise in unemployment. And you can see here, this first yellow band is actually the pandemic. And you see there is a decline in employment. It's not like it has no effect, but it's really much smaller than the one we get a few years later, caused by the depression of 1921-22, which of course was caused entirely by economic factors and has no pandemic aspects to it. So you can see that, it's there. It's not completely trivial, but it's dwarfed by what was happening afterwards. Okay. Now this is the modern data, and you can sort of see the bottom line is a rise in unemployment claims as a result of the worst business cycle that we had in terms of unemployment claims. This is 1982, and the blue line is March 20 to August 20. And you sort of see it just in terms of unemployment claims, this effect is just vast. This is as it goes back as early as March 2020. And you can sort of see this is the unemployment claims. And you see that it goes up in that crisis. And of course, it'll go up here. This is the Great Recession. And this is COVID. And this is orders of magnitude worse than anything we have experienced before. And it's worse than that. These numbers don't give you the full picture because as labor force participation goes down, of course, unemployment statistics go down because you have to be in the labor force to be counted as unemployed. And there's a great sharp decline in labor force participation, and for all the reasons that we know, right? Okay, so people cannot find childcare, drop out of the labor force. People are scared of infection, and people who have given up on looking for jobs. And what's more, of course, unemployment isn't just big, it is located in particularly vulnerable groups, service sector workers, women, immigrants and minorities, people with relatively lower level of education, and of course related to that, workers who cannot work remotely like the rest of us. And the problem, I think, is, to coin another phrase, an abundance of caution. Both that authority closed down businesses because they want to stop the spreading of the disease, but also because their customers are afraid of showing up for exactly the same reason. And so both of those things work hand in hand to really hit the economy badly. So this is the GDP statistic. And this is, you can sort of see it, percentage change from preceding quarters. So if it's positive, we're growing. If it's negative, we're going down. And you can sort of see what happened in the second quarter. It's coming back a little bit. I didn't have the third quarter data yet to make this graph, but it'll rise a little bit, but we're nowhere where we were when this started. And that's very different than in 1918. So it's harder to calculate the exact economic impact of the flu, much as my colleagues have been trying. Of course, in part because it's obscured by other effects. It's taking place during a war, which isn't just ending as the COVID is raging, and because the numbers are, as always, more controversial. But there is a consensus that real per capita GDP in the US in the 3 years following the 1918 pandemic is a teeny tiny bit lower than it was in the peak years of World War I, and that areas that were affected more by the flu experienced a more substantial decline of output. So it's not like there's no effect, but output soon fully recovered from its slump. And if you look at the aggregate, the sharpest contraction of GDP actually occurs in 1921 during that depression and was unrelated to the pandemic. By late 22, when that cycle is over, real GDP is about 10% higher than it was in 1913 and 1914. So here are some numbers. Two of these are alternative indexes. The one on the bottom is by Christy Romer, and she actually finds no decline at all. There's a bit of slowing down of growth. The same is true by the standard series. The data that were collected by Nathan Balky and my colleague Bob Gordon shows some decline, but here too you can sort of see that what happens in 1918 isn't nearly as bad as what happened during the cycle of 21, 22. So our aggregate figures are a little bit dicey, so I decided to give you something slightly more micro. So this is railroad freight carload shipments from automobile factories. So it's an indicator of a certain sector of the economy. And sure enough, if you look at what's happening during the pandemic, it's going down, so the effect is there. But again, the effect is smaller than what you get in the crisis of 21. So that all points more or less in the same direction. And so why the difference? Why is this huge divergence? And you know, the answer must be in part, and this is something that I haven't fully thought through. So if somebody wants to jump on me for that, you're more than welcome. But I would put it this way. In the intervening century, since the pandemic, humanity has beaten infectious disease into a corner. So the numbers are completely indisputable. Infectious disease mortality in the US declined during the first 8 decades of the 20th century from about 800 deaths per 100,000 to 36 deaths per 100,000. That's deaths attributed to infectious disease. So these things are interrupted, of course, in part by the influenza epidemic itself, and especially between 1938 to 52, it's very, very rapid, in part, I suppose, because of antibiotics, but other things going on as well. Now, there's some rearguard action by microbes and viruses, pretty bad, but not demographically mind-blowing. HIV, Ebola, not in this country, swine flu, multi-drug resistance to tuberculosis, and so on and so forth. But these have been, on average, I think, second order, and the trend has been relentless. So here's the trend. You can sort of see this pink line. This is the flu pandemic, and you can see it's going down more or less steadily. It's more or less stabilized now, also in a little bit rise because of, I think this rise here is probably mostly because of HIV, but it doesn't take us nearly back to what we say observed in the beginning of the 20th century. So you know, so here's the question: if everything is so good, why is everything so bad? And so here is something to think about. If COVID-19 had hit the world in 1750, let alone in 1350, it would barely have been noticed. In fact, we can't even be sure it didn't happen. It just, nobody paid attention to it because it was so. So the case mortality rate of COVID-19, as far as it can be estimated now, is only about 2.5 to 3%, which by historical standards barely registers. And if it had happened in 1750, it would have been even better because it hits particularly old people. And of course, in 1750, there weren't that many old people around relatively now, and the median age is much lower than it is today. But what, of course, we should worry about, and that is the bad news, is the long-term effects of later in life health and later in life economic outcomes. And that, I think, is something that really, so this is actually well known in the economic history literature and not that well known outside it, I think. But there's a classic paper by Doug Amond in 2006 and a subsequent literature that argued about it. But basically what Amond found was that the epidemic of 1918, the flu epidemic had wide-ranging adverse effect on later in life human capital and labor market outcomes. Among those cohorts that are exposed to the pandemic in utero, so you know, women who were pregnant and got the flu, their babies had much worse later in life outcome. And that, and what Amund and others have shown is that these lead to substantial reductions in high school completion rates, wages, socioeconomic status, you know, likelihood of incarceration, all these outcome variables that economic historians know and love. And that, and the probability of physical disability as well. And so I would say for COVID-19, in utero exposure is probably relatively minor, so we don't actually know very much about it. But what I really worry about is other effects that will persist, not years, but decades. You think about things like interrupted schooling, domestic disruptions, I don't need to we're all going through them, a sharp rise in poverty, in inequality, and in the stress associated with them, the loss of intangible capital of small businesses that are going out of business and, you know, will have a long time recovering. These things may still be detectable many decades from now. So these economic effects are not just severe, they're also long lasting. And so the irony, I think, is that one reason why COVID has been so devastating is that it changed people's behavior, as I said. And I think the reason is that what happened in the 20th century has essentially made transmissible diseases something we are no longer willing to accept. And this is pure speculation on my part, okay? I have no evidence to back this up. It's never stopped me before. Non-transmissible diseases such as cancer and heart disease are more acceptable because they are known unknowns. The problem with COVID-19, and sorry if I sound Rumsfeldian here, is that this is an unknown unknown. And we're looking at more than risk. We're looking at what economists call ambiguity, meaning not only that there's something unknown, but we don't know how unknown it is. That is something we are very, very scared of and averse to, okay? And so we have become complacent about infectious diseases. Now we have been warned, you know, Bill Gates in his famous Munich speech in February 2017, which we've all, you know, people have been ignoring Cassandra since Euripides. And it's more because there were past alarms and most of them haven't panned out demographically. You know, MERS and SARS and swine flu and Ebola, there were these scares and none of them became something really big. So, you know, we were skeptical and we worried about other things, not viruses. And now this thing has hit us. And I would submit as a closing thought is nothing is more upsetting than being disillusioned after being complacent. And who more than Americans should know that? So just to summarize, we are never ready for black swans, okay? By definition, that's what a black swan is. We close the barn doors after the horses have fled, clearly, we're very good at that. We're better equipped to deal with the pandemic than in 1918, and the virus will presumably fade, if not disappear altogether. But the economic and social damage will linger much longer, unlike 1918. Thank you. All right, I am stop sharing the screen.
Please join me in thanking Professor Mokyr for that really wonderful presentation. Our final speaker is Helen Tilly, Associate Professor in the Department of History. She has asked me to spare her a fulsome introduction, so I won't give one, but simply to say that her publications include Africa as a Living Laboratory, Empire Development of the Problem of Scientific Knowledge, 1870 to 1950, winner of the Ludwig Fleck Prize of the Society for Social Studies of Science, and her current research directly addresses COVID, including an article on somatosphere.net on how to make sense of traditional Chinese medicine in a time of COVID-19, and a forthcoming article on the vaccine controversy in Africa and COVID in the Journal of West African History. So she is the ideal person to put our present moment in context for us with a presentation on how to historicize pandemics present and why it matters. Professor Tilly.
Great, thanks so much. We are also exuberant about our subject matters. So I'm going to dive right in, and I'm going to preface my comments with two remarks. First is just to note Gatto's January 31st cartoon that was publicized first in East Africa and then was republished in the New York Times. It was on January 31st, which was the day after the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a planetary emergency, which is their highest ranking. So I'm going to start with pedagogical precepts that I use with my undergraduates, and I think they're useful because they help us historicize the present as much as the past. Bruce Aylward, Assistant Director of WHO when the pandemic began, used this cautionary sentence: if you've seen one pandemic, you've seen one pandemic. And he was really wanting people to focus on all of the contingencies that anyone dealing with a health crisis address, and the specificity of disease agents and disease ecologies, because as Ed has already made clear, even with plague, disease ecologies matter as much, and as Joel has made clear, economic and political ramifications matter. So Alex DeWall, an Africanist, weighed in during the pandemic with a great article in Boston Review, New Pathogen, Old Politics, and I am paraphrasing his insight. Even new pathogens can generate old social logics. And I use these two ideas with my students to help them understand that people tend to respond in somewhat structured ways, scripted ways. There tends to be expert confusion around new pandemics. There tends to be scapegoating. And since about the 1890s, there tend to be military metaphors, wars on disease. There tend to be some acceptance of disposable people. And most recently, this pandemic actually gave us a new word, the infodemic. And it turns out that one person is responsible for generating the most misinformation and disinformation on the planet during this pandemic. One person with a particularly large bully pulpit. And I won't say much more than that, except to foreshadow that this pandemic, because of the power of the United States, has also been shaped and perceived through the lens of the US experience, and that has a distorting effect. Another precept I use is that pandemics unfold and are controlled as patchworks, and I borrow this unapologetically from Ed Young, who has done some of the best reporting in the Atlantic on the US experience, and this is from his America's Patchwork Pandemic. I'm going to add something that Ed doesn't actually address, which is legal jurisdictions. The actual issue of states, nation states matters, but as anybody knows who's followed the pandemic, municipalities, counties, state level in the United States matter as well. States and pandemics have to coordinate. That's an insight that I'll talk about in just a minute. And for historians, the units of analysis that we use matter, and nation states as containers rarely serve the purpose well. This is an illustration of that patchwork effect, and I won't go over this, but I do with my undergraduates, where they can click on any one of these and see the literal fatality rates up through the 3rd of July in different parts of Europe. If you want to understand why people are so opposed to herd immunity, Sweden compared to Norway and Finland is a nice illustration. If you want to understand excess mortality and the uneven effects of the pandemic in Italy, you can use this lovely map that was recently put out by the Financial Times. If you want to understand the US and the uneven experiences in inner cities, city suburbs, medium cities, rural towns, small towns, some parts of the US have experienced a bigger second wave, so small cities right here. And some parts, the larger cities, have managed to keep it under control. And that patchwork effect matters for both explaining it and controlling it. Another precept that historians have been banging home during this pandemic, and Joel, in a sense, foreshadowed this as well, pandemics have a beginning and a middle, but rarely a true end. And this is a correction of certain medical historians who used to talk about pandemics literally as storytelling and focusing on a beginning and a middle and an end. But many emerging diseases, once they've achieved a transnational scale, rarely go away. So cholera, plague, HIV/AIDS, even Ebola begins to transcend its original endemic foci. Sorry, I skipped that. Pandemics, as we all know, hold up a mirror to society. They trace and exacerbate social injustices and inequalities. So for those of you, of course, who have followed the uneven effects of the pandemic, used this slide on October 12th, Indigenous Peoples Day, in my classroom. And at that point, almost 220,000 people had died in the US. And this slide focuses on African Americans compared to white Americans, dying at twice the rate. But if you can look at the slightly less, the shaded areas for Latino and Latina populations at 65 per 100,000, Pacific Islanders and Indigenous populations at a higher rate. So we know that the effects are felt more acutely, particularly among African American and Indigenous and Pacific Islander populations. Arundhati Roy published a really poignant piece looking at the lockdown in India, and she said pandemics, actually this is my riff on her, so she talked about pandemics as portals. So I'm paraphrasing that. Pandemics open portals. They remake worlds past, present, and future. And there's no way any of us could tell the history of the last 4 or 5 years without having the coronavirus pandemic as part of our imagination. Now, I use 3 slides to help give my students an understanding of how the world was unified around infectious diseases. If you think about the planet as a disease pool, I talk about 6 phases. Ed has already talked about the first phase, and recent scholarship on the Black Death, particularly by Monica Green, has helped us understand the African dimension of the Black Death and has begun to quantify its impact. I use these slides also to remind students that particular disease control strategies arise at the same time that pandemics are taking place. So if you look at the second phase with the triangular trade in disease, with the circulation of smallpox, malaria, syphilis, the immense fatality rates across the Americas, both through infectious disease and through violent conquest, helped pave the way for systems of slavery. The Spanish Empire was the first entity to experiment with a transnational, trans-imperial vaccination campaign. Students often find that surprising. The cholera pandemics and the plague pandemic really shifted the nature of infectious diseases in the United States. So with the cholera pandemic in particular, it's led to the development of the first transnational scaffolding of multinational organizations coming together to try and control disease, predominantly because of trade. It was not a humanitarian motive. So the international sanitary conferences from the second half of the 19th century met 10 times to literally deal with this issue of disease, knowing no political borders. The plague pandemic led to something that Joel kept referring to, a great divergence in mortality rates around infectious diseases on the planet. So the plague pandemic at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century really led to extremely disparate fatality rates in parts of Asia and Africa compared to parts of Europe and North America. And that experience led to 2 different things. One was the insight that public health infrastructures actually mattered a great deal to protecting people. And the second was a new system within urban centers, particularly port cities, of racial segregation, race-based concerns around property, protecting property, income levels, and keeping different groups segregated from each other. And it hardened structural racisms. So the last phase really gets us into the 20th century, and this is a direct consequence in some ways of total wars, of the First World War and troop mobility and mobilization and the three waves. And I won't say much more about this because Joel's covered it, but this is where we get the face masks and social distancing strategies. And historically, the very studies of influenza led to the language of flattening the curve. With the Second World War, we get insecticides and antibiotics, but again, going back to the idea that pandemics don't have an end, to date, only one disease has really been eradicated: smallpox in humans. Rinderpest in cattle has also been eradicated. Polio is somewhat on the margins. For those of you who like these kinds of graphs, I'm not going to linger long on this because I only have a few more minutes, but the Financial Times helped us appreciate that in a sense, the peak death period, which you can see here, which was really the spring and affected largely in Europe and the US, the peak death period hasn't actually substantially subsided at any one point. It's just shifted. So this is another way to think about the pandemic as patchworks. The epicenters are now, and I'm sorry for those of you who love these images, because I do, I study them constantly. I'm going to keep going because we're running short of time, but I'm happy to share my slides with anyone. I'm getting into the SARS coronavirus pandemic and reminding you of a few salient points that matter globally. So China alerting the WHO on December 31st, which kind of starts one clock. By January 12th, the fact that the full genome was shared started another clock in terms of developing a diagnostic test, which was done in a standardized way within just a few days by German scientists and ultimately adopted by the World Health Organization. That standard test has actually been circulated far more widely than anything that the CDC developed. As many of you probably know, the CDC decided to go its own way. It developed a test. It was flawed. It took until February 26th for the US to have its own internal CDC test. They never adopted the WHO test, and that was the window for controlling, testing, tracing, and using those kinds of interventions. Here is the kind of start of October snapshot of different epicenters, and one salient surprise, if you look at the continent of Africa, I think the stories around Brazil, the stories around the US, the growing situation in India are fairly well known. Most of you probably are aware that the predictions that it was going to overwhelm African countries has not happened. So only about 3% of all global fatalities happened in the continent of Africa, while in the US, it was, until quite recently, up around 22%. It's going down as the fatality rates go up. It's going down for the US, the percentage as the fatality rates go up. So one thing I'm going to skip over, you can see a headline from March 15th, the ticking time bomb, the spread of in Africa. The projections were about 4 million deaths as a high, 300,000. I think it's about 36,000 now for the continent. Now, this is where I get into the points that I make with my students all the time. Beware strategic ignorance, hubris, and denied histories, or geopolitics predictably distorts knowledge and perceptions. Reality is never just about truth. It is also about power and trust. And I use this slide to help students understand the issue of context-dependent knowledge production, that often it's not when things are true they hold, but really it's when things hold they start to become true. And anyone who studies the history of empire and the distortions about different peoples around the world will understand that right away. The powerful created the reality of various stereotypes about people colonized, and then that takes decades to undo. So in no universe, I tell my students, does power, political, economic, social, and non-human cease to matter. Calls to believe science or follow science depend on people and institutions having power. And you can see that in the United States as the CDC's power has actually been stripped of it. What works and what is effective typically depend on dominant definitions of reality. So I know we barely have any time for questions. The global ranking systems that were developed in the fall of 2019 give us a great snapshot of the assumptions built into global governance often, and I'm thinking about the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, and even some UN agencies. The US and the UK ranked themselves in the top, literally number 1 and number 2 in pandemic preparedness in the fall of 2019 because of their proven capabilities for stopping disease outbreaks at the source. I'll just leave you with that. And what I'm going to finish with is, this is another wonderful map looking at all of the different imported cases, the index cases for different African countries. And I've been in touch with the students, faculty, and independent non-governmental actors who produced this. The few salient things to know, the predictions about Africa were made based on no state response. And as it turns out, there was a considerable state response, but there was also considerable public response. And the two things worked in tandem, centralized and decentralized efforts. And it's well known that the cases came from Europe and North America, not from Asia. So Pan-African organizations actually spearheaded it out of the African Union, where the Africa's 5 Centers for Disease Control were located. But the Pan-African response, it's the only continent in the world that has followed a continental level response and that has had significantly lower disinformation and misinformation campaigns. They've also scaled up the infrastructure for simple biomedical processes that are low cost, civic and mutual aid groups, and just a phenomenal array of voluntary organizations also did their own part to flatten the curve. And there have been an array of small scale social welfare projects. Now, Simon Allison, the editor of the Mail and Guardian, said, with notable exceptions, the response of most African countries to the unprecedented public health threat has been better organized, better informed, and better implemented than many of their Western counterparts. And I just think that's empirically true. But the last thing I'll end on is that anyone who understands the power of states also understands the power of states to do violence. So the cartoon on the left came out on the 6th of June after the murder of George Floyd, where people were understanding that SARS literally had 2 different meanings, especially in one country, Nigeria, the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, where a campaign started against SARS in 2017, and it really picked up in pace in October. And some of you have probably seen that. Jelani Cobb of the New Yorker coined this concept of a cubed crisis, the global pandemic, state violence, and economic catastrophe for so many. So I'll end here with this image because I think it's poignant for our times.
Thank you very much, Helen. And we really are almost out of time, but very quickly, does anyone have a question for our panelists? And you can put that in chat or use the hand raising feature.
We were too exuberant and we took up all the time.
Okay, well, if there aren't any questions, and given that we are now at 2 o'clock, perhaps you'll join me in thanking all of our panelists for sharing their wisdom with us, and thank you all for attending.